I guess we would call this a little bit of an after show. A little bit of an after show here on the Firebrand Brief. Turned out to be not so brief after all. Lord have mercy. All right, so a couple of points about the Inquisition. Again, if you caught this late, let me give you a little foundation. My early days as an apologist was literally apologizing for the Inquisition. Every time I tried to get into an argument, a discussion, a conversation, a debate, standing up for Catholicism and the Catholic faith and the Catholic Church, people always had that to throw out there. The church murdered billions and billions and billions of Jews during the Spanish Inquisition and this and that other historical fallacy. My habit, almost reflexively, was to say, yeah, that's true. Well, we're real sorry about that. But the Catholic Mass, wait, the sacraments, the sacrament. It's really hard to come out on top when you have to start your argument with, we're real sorry about that. We really screwed that one up. I got to a point where I realized I don't really know what I'm apologizing for. I know about the myths. I've seen them in the movies. I've seen them in Monty Python. I know about the myths. I know about the rhetoric. I don't actually know about the facts. And so, fittingly, I realized this in a library. So I started reading books and commentary on the Spanish Inquisition. I knew the hell out of it back in the day. I remembered names and dates and years. I don't have it like that anymore. But here's what I can tell you, some things about the Inquisition. Did the Inquisition happen? Yes. Was it a Catholic Church thing? No. The Inquisition was started by Spanish monarchs with the cooperation, sometimes coerced, sometimes free cooperation of the church in Spain. That's why it's the Spanish Inquisition. What is an inquisition? An inquisition is basically a mechanism of the church used to address and correct a heresy. Let's say you come to me and you say, this is not a great example, but you come to me and say, I believe that the Holy Eucharist is just bread and wine. Well, that's a heresy. Okay. So an inquisition, let's say you're a diocese, you're a Catholic diocese that believe, the bishop teaches this, all of the priests believe this, and this is what you're teaching the people. The church at the time would launch an inquisition, but also going back to the old days, an inquisition might even be launched against an individual person, a single person. And that was basically an interview. Why do you believe this? Who taught you this? And this wasn't like, under the pain of torture. It was literally an interview. Why do you believe this? Where did you get this from? And the conversation would progress, and then the inquisitor would attempt to correct the person who has the heretical idea. Do you know, this is what the church teaches, and this is why. No, I don't believe it. Well, hear me out. This is what we have from Scripture. This is what we have from sacred tradition, the church fathers, whatever. This is what the Holy Eucharist is, and this is why, and so on and so on. And then the person who has this heretical belief says, oh, that makes sense. So now do you believe in the real presence of the Eucharist, of Christ in the Eucharist? Yes, I do. Okay, for your penance, you have to spend 3 days in a prison doing prayer and penances. Or the prison was your penance, and pray and read this book. Whatever. So there was sometimes, but not always, a civil penalty because the church and the state of the time were closely knit, which is why Europe became what Europe is, because the church and the state were closely knit. So before anybody shakes their head and says, yeah, that sucked, mind what you're talking about, because were it not for that, you would be speaking Arabic right now and praying to Mecca. It's another conversation. So 3 days in a prison was not like 3 days of hard labor. It was 3 days in like a barn or something. And you were fed and all that, and you had to do prayers. And, so there was, like any penance, you kind of make it up as you go, but there were some standard penalties. Okay. The penalty wasn't you were going to be flogged. Well, I changed my mind. Well, you're going to be flogged anyway. The penalty was not flogging. The penalty was not being burned at the stake. Nothing like that. That was a proper inquisition. What if you said, no, I still believe that the Holy Eucharist is just bread? Well, what was the church's response? And generally, this was the local church that did this. It wasn't like somebody came from, well, I guess sometimes someone might have come from the Vatican, but usually it was the local church that handled these. I still believe in my heretical belief. I still hold my heretical belief. Okay, then you have to leave. Oh, leave the office? No, you have to leave town. You have to go far away. That's your penalty until you change your mind. you are excommunicated. Why? First, because being excommunicated in an ecclesial and a literal sense, being sent away, will make you think twice about what you believe. That's really what an excommunication is for. It's not just to punish. It's supposed to be corrective, okay? Also, we can't have you infecting the rest of the faithful with your heresy. That's why you have to leave town. We can't. Why? Why is it a problem for people to think for themselves if they risk believing this heresy? Because the church and the state were tightly aligned. Whenever you had heresy erupt in a local ordinariate, like a local diocese, you know what followed? Rebellion, infighting, civil wars, and the destruction of the local ordinariate. Not just the church, but like the village or the little city or whatever. This is why Catholic teaching was very tightly protected, very carefully protected, okay? Because when you had heresy, you also had the destruction of the locality, or you risked it, and in some cases, it happened. So that's why you have to go away. We can't have you infecting other people with this crazy thought. All right? Now, what was the Spanish Inquisition? Spain had just been occupied by the Muslim Empire, I want to say like 800 years or something like that, but I might be confusing that with the British occupation of Ireland, which was also a few hundred years. So it was a long time, let's put it that way. I think it was 800 years. Now, Spain is on the mend. Spain is on the up and up. The Spanish monarchs, again, have control of Spain, yada, 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 yada. But non-Catholics still live in Spain. Muslims and Jews. They were coexisting. I'm sure they weren't coexisting in total perfect peace. There's hurt feelings, there's grudges and whatnot. Okay. That's the human element. But mostly they were coexisting, okay? But now remember, Spain just got rid of the Muslim Empire, right? There were Muslims and even some Jews who were secretly, clandestinely collaborating with the Muslim Empire to assist and aid the Muslim Empire to return to Spain and overthrow the monarchs. Now, the Spanish monarchs had spies all over the place. Again, they just got rid of the Muslim Empire, okay? So they're real on their toes, okay? They're high anxiety right now. The spies returned this information to the monarchs, that there are some Muslims who are collaborating with the Muslim Empire. There are some Jews collaborating with the Muslim Empire, which today is unthinkable, but this is historical fact. There are also, and this is important, this is very important, there are also Catholic converts from Judaism and Islam who converted, but they aren't really Catholic. They're still Jews, they're still practicing Judaism or Islam. They just converted so that they would go unnoticed. They didn't really become Catholic. They just converted like in name only, I guess you might say. So, what do we call a Catholic who practices paganism? Chat room, what do we call a Catholic who practices paganism? Begins with an H. We just used that word. I'm going to wait a second to see if anyone chimes in. A Catholic who practices paganism or who believes something contrary to what the church teaches, we call those heretics. Well, what do we do in the church, especially at the time? What do we do with heretics? We subject them to an inquisition. Now you have the Spanish Inquisition. There you go. Mountains of Vasilium got it. That's where the Spanish Inquisition came from. It was the Spanish monarchs, in collaboration with the church in Spain, launching an inquisition, not really to find heretics. They just used that as an excuse. Really what they were looking for were spies. Spies is what they were looking for. And they used the mechanism of an inquisition to do it. The church, the Catholic, the Vatican, tried to get this to stop. But the monarchs refused, and of course the church in Spain, some under coercion, some free will, collaborated and cooperated with the monarchs. But the Catholic Church did try to get it to stop, okay, because it was an abuse of the mechanism of an inquisition. And I think they didn't have authority to do that or something. There was something else about that. What about all these people that... So the first thing we have is the Inquisition was not about forcibly making Jews convert to Catholicism or Muslims convert to Catholicism. That's not what that was. Okay, so that's the first myth. Also, what about all of these executions? Well, executions happened, but they were very few. They're very, very few. I used to have, now, how many? That number goes this way and that, north and south, east and west, depending on the researcher, okay? Obviously, records of every execution are not going to be kept well, and even when they are, they're not going to survive hundreds of years, okay? But it was a fairly low number. I'm not going to cite a number to you because I can't remember, and I don't want to put misinformation out there, but it was a fairly, very low number. Okay, it certainly wasn't. The reason I laugh every time I talk about how many people got executed during the Inquisition is because I remember in a debate, an actual debate, someone said the Catholic Church executed, just to throw out a number, 1 billion people. Like, this was like their official number. And it turns out that I knew how many people lived in Spain during the period of the Inquisition, and it wasn't anywhere close. Of the total population, wasn't anywhere close to what this guy had said. That's why every time I talk about that, I remember that and laugh. That's why I laugh every time I say that. So it wasn't a lot of executions. It was very few. The executions generally were not because they weren't Catholic. It's because they were discovered to be spies. And what do you do with spies back in the day? You execute them. You can pass moral judgment on it today if you want, but that was just normal back in the day, okay? What about torture chambers? Torture chambers happened, but they were also rare, okay? And usually, generally, this was to extract information from people who they had discovered to be spies. Again, you can pass moral judgment on it if you like. That's fine, but I'm talking about the context of a different period in human history, okay? So not everyone interviewed during the Inquisition was tortured. Very few were. Not everyone was executed. Very few were. Well, what about burning people alive? So there were instances of people being burned alive, but they were burned, but not really. They were burned alive in effigy. They weren't literally burned alive. They were executed or imprisoned, like for life or something, and they were burned alive in effigy. That was also rare. That was more of a demonstration. It wasn't an actual literal execution. Were some people literally burned alive during the Spanish Inquisition? Maybe. I mean, it happened so rarely that I don't recall seeing that number. But it was a different time and a different place where being burned alive was a known method of execution. Did it happen? Maybe. But was it widespread? No. Well, what about these awful prisons? Let's talk about the awful prisons. The Inquisition prisons were so lenient and so comfortable that there were real criminals telling lies so that they could get transferred to an Inquisition prison. So let's say you're in prison for, I don't know, murder, whatever the crime. And some people would say, oh, and I'm also a heretic. I'm simplifying it, but you get the point. I'm also a heretic. Well, now you get moved to the Inquisition prison because you have to talk to the Inquisitor. Now, friends, let me tell you, this is true. This is not myth. This is true, okay? And this is not true from one author of one history book. I have known this across 3 or 4 books that I had read on the Inquisition at the time, okay? This was like a repeating thing. This is known. They were criminals who were telling lies, just to simplify it, saying that they were heretics so that they could get moved to the Inquisition prisons because they were so lenient and comfortable by comparison. If the Inquisition were all about torture chambers and executions, do you think people would be telling lies to be sent there? I'm going to leave that for you to judge. So that's the prisons. So there were Inquisition prisons. And now listen, I have never been to an Inquisition prison. Okay. So I can't tell you how beautiful and lovely they were. I mean, they were prisons of the time, but they were not dungeons. There were no torture. I mean, did torture happen? Yes, but it was not widespread like people have might have you believe. So this army of dungeons, this army of torture chambers, and these mass executions, all of that is fallacy. All of that is false. Does the Spanish church come out clean from the Inquisition? I guess not. But when you look at the facts, those are mitigating facts, aren't they? What the prisons were really like, the numbers of executions and so on. Those are pretty mitigating facts, right? Well, to mitigate it further, understand that this was a different time and a different place. Spain was just recently liberated from the Muslim Empire. They were on high alert. Torture was normal in the extraction of information. That was normal. Execution, whether it was by hanging, beheading, being burned alive, all these things that we find barbaric today, that was normal back then. Do they come out smelling like roses? I guess not. But do they come out smelling like fire and brimstone from hell? No. You can imagine my surprise as I was reading these things, having spent, I don't know, a period of time saying, sorry about the Inquisition. It got to a point now that I was, you know what? I'll never forget this. It got to a point where I was inviting debate about the Inquisition and nobody took me up on it. I remember being so pissed off about that because now I was ready to put people in their place because I knew the hell out of the Inquisition and nobody wanted to talk about it. Like, son of a... True story. Also, I'd spent a lot of time researching things like Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, because these people were always on a Catholic's case, whether it was mine or other Catholics. They loved to get a Catholic. So, and I remember I was having a conversation with, actually this happened with, I remember distinctly these two Mormons, and on other occasions, this Jehovah's Witness. But what I'm about to tell you happened with both of these cases, where I was trying like hell to debate them, right? You know, the Catholic Church teaches yada, 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 but this is what the Bible teaches. And I remember trying like hell to debate them, but really not knowing what I was talking about, but just trying in the moment to interpret the scripture that they were calling out, to interpret it as best as I could in the moment. Now I'm a kid, you know, to try to outsmart them or out-argue them. And this left me, and so I did a good enough job to buy myself some time. Not to win an argument, but to buy myself some time. And I was hell-bent on that never happening again. So anytime I found myself in this situation, I was going to crush my opponent. And I mean, and those of you following me a long time, you know that this is how I roll. Crush. Bulletproof arguments, super aggressive in my argumentation. So I'm doing this, you know, here and there, reading, and I guess you could call it research, but that does kind of put it on a different level. But okay, research, reading, study, not just of what they believe, but of the scripture, of the Bible. And so I was ready. And there were times that I would present, almost like put a target on myself. You know, like if I see Mormons walking around, Jehovah's Witnesses, I would like carry a rosary or something. I remember one time carrying a rosary, like holding it out, you know, so that they would see that I was Catholic and then try to convert me. So I would do things like that, or try and pick fights. I always say picking fights, but obviously it's not physical. Picking fights with Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. And none of them would take me up on it. Now that I was all ready to crush them, none of them would take me up on it. I was like, that still burns my ass to this day. I was all rough and ready, you know, to bury a heretic, and now none of them want to fight. Same thing with the Inquisition stuff, man. I was like, now that I know all that stuff, it's like nobody wants to take me up. What I think happened was they detected that I was very confident about it, and they knew they didn't know shit about it, so they weren't going to take me up on it. I think I projected too much confidence. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. So here's my advice. If you ever are confident about a subject that you're willing to debate on, don't let your opponent know how confident you are. Don't give them any signals that you know what you're talking about. Actually, I do that a little bit now. You know, if ever there's like this, whether it's a comment online or something in person, I always act coy. Like, really? Does the church teach that? Tell me more. And I always try to draw them in. You should do that. Don't project too much confidence or you're going to scare them away. Okay? I guess this is a good time to bring this episode to a close. Let me just wait a little bit. All right, man. Tap like, tap subscribe, drop a comment. It really helps me out. It signals the algorithm that this content is worthy. And of course, subscribe so that you never miss the heat. And if you do check out the link to the article in that description there, once you get to my Substack, consider subscribing. It's free. And this way, new articles get sent to your inbox. You don't have to worry about an algorithm coming between you and the truth. Follow the Truth Bomber at Real TJ Haynes everywhere on socials, especially on X. Thank you for joining me, everybody. God bless you, and God be with you all. Bye-bye.